All right, welcome back. This month we're going to be talking about equipment and the equipment that you need specifically to create your own video content. My name is Tim Adams with Tomato Productions. So this week we're going to be talking about camera, the basics of a camera. So often these days you're seeing content being produced on SLRs or DSLRs. And the idea there is that you can have one camera to shoot really high quality video, but you can also take really good still pictures, so you can use it for video and photography. But where do you get started? And what I have found is that it's very important that you first understand how a picture or how a video is generated. Now, video is simply just a series of pictures that are combined together to produce motion. All right, so we're going to be focusing on the aspects of the camera that fit into what's called the exposure triangle. Okay, there's three aspects. There's shutter speed, aperture, and ISO. And we're going to deal with each one in turn. Shutter speed is the length that the shutter is open to generate an exposure. Okay, so what you're going to see right now is you're going to see examples of a short or a very fast shutter speed. Okay, so it's open for just a fraction of a second. You're going to see a more standard exposure length of, say, a 60th of a second versus 1/500th of a second. And then you're going to see what we call a long exposure, or in this case, the shutter is open for 30 seconds. And the idea is the longer the shutter is open, the more light enters the lens and hits the sensor. Now, there's tricks to making sure that the longer you keep your shutter open, how you expose that properly, because the more light that's hitting it, it's very easy to overexpose the image so that it's too bright. Okay, so the second point in that exposure triangle is the aperture. So this has to do with how wide the opening is on the lens. And this directly affects how much light enters into the lens and hits the sensor while the shutter is open. Okay, so remember we talked about shutter speed, now we're talking about aperture, and these things work together to generate an exposure. Now the thing about aperture, okay, it's measured in a decimal, okay, so f2.8, f4.0, 6.3, and it usually goes up to f22, all right, so depending on the lens, but that's a fairly standard maximum aperture. The other thing to understand about aperture is that it's backwards to how you might think of it. You might think that the lower the number, the smaller the opening. It's actually opposite of that. The lower the number, the wider the aperture. Don't ask me why. I didn't create it. That's just the way it is. So the smaller the opening, the higher the number. So f22 is very, very small, and f2.8 is wide open, depending on your lens. Not all lenses go to f2.8. They have a maximum aperture. It's usually 2.8, 4.0, 5.6, something like that. The really big telephoto lenses are going to be something like f8. So you have to have a lot of light in order to use that lens. And, they're generally outdoor lenses for like nature photography and that kind of thing. The final thing I'm going to mention about aperture is that it directly affects your depth of field. Depth of field is simply objects that are in the frame, that are in front of the camera, and how much of that is in focus, okay? The wider open your aperture, okay, the more light that's coming in, the shallower your depth of field, okay? The smaller the aperture, the more or the deeper the depth of field is. So imagine you're shooting a tree and you have a field behind it, okay? You get your focus set, and let's say you're shooting wide open at f2.8, okay, with a really high shutter speed to compensate for the amount of light that's entering into the lens. All right. Well, a shallow depth of field means that you get the tree in focus, and maybe the front part of the trunk is the only thing that is in focus. The rest of the trunk behind that focus plane is out of focus because you have a very shallow depth of field, okay? So the distance away from the camera determines that depth of field, okay? Now, let's say that you have a slower shutter speed, but you have a smaller aperture, okay? So now you've extended your depth of field so that not only is the tree in focus, but half the field is in focus behind it. Okay, so hopefully that explains depth of field and how aperture can affect that. The final piece of the exposure triangle is ISO. Think of it as gain, if you will, okay? And it takes the light that is currently coming in the lens, which you set with your shutter speed and your aperture, okay? It takes that light and it boosts it, all right? And this is really helpful when you're shooting in lower light conditions. The problem is by boosting it, you run the risk of adding grain. And with film, okay, 35 millimeter film, you know, depending on the kind of film you were using, the manufacturer or the speed of the film, okay, so those were measured in 400, 800, 1600. It's the exact same way that ISO is measured, okay, so the higher the number, the more sensitive your sensor is going to be to light, but the more noise it's going to generate in the image. That's the risk you run with higher ISOs. Now, there's some cameras on the market that can go to extremely high ISOs and have minimal noise. If you choose to invest in that, that's great. However, they tend to be on the spendy side, obviously, because they have more technology in them. All right, so that is camera basics. I know it's not as probably in depth as you would like, but again, if you have questions, put your email in at the end of this video, and I will get right back to you with some resources to help explain more in depth about these concepts.